Picture this. A mother tucks her infant daughter into bed, while outside the temperature drops to -40 degrees Celsius. The wind is screaming through mountain passes so narrow and brutal that experienced soldiers have turned back from them. Snow is falling so heavily that the village has been completely invisible from the valley below for 3 days. There is no electricity, no heating system, no insulated walls, no emergency services within hours of travel even in good conditions. And right now conditions are the worst they will be all year. That baby sleeps through the night. Warm, safe, alive. Now picture the same scenario, but you are the one responsible for keeping that baby alive. You have no thermostat to adjust, no electric blanket to plug in, no app on your phone telling you the temperature is dropping faster than expected, no backup plan if your primary heating method fails. Just the knowledge in your head, the materials in your home, and the experience accumulated through a lifetime of winters in one of the most brutal mountain environments on Earth. Could you do it? Afghan mountain families have been doing exactly this for centuries. Not occasionally surviving, not barely making it through, but raising children, keeping grandparents alive, maintaining entire communities through winter conditions that would destroy most modern people within hours of losing access to technology. And they did it with nothing that required electricity, nothing that required manufactured materials, nothing that required supply chains or infrastructure, or anything beyond what the mountain environment and their own knowledge provided. Before we reveal exactly how they did it, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if stories of ancient survival knowledge fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn will completely change how you understand human resilience and what people are capable of when survival depends entirely on knowledge rather than technology. The first thing you need to understand is what these families were actually facing. Because most people who haven't experienced genuine high-altitude mountain winter cold don't fully comprehend what the word freezing means in this context. This isn't the cold of a difficult winter in a northern city where you wear an extra coat and complain about the heating bill. This is cold that kills livestock overnight. Cold that freezes the moisture inside your nose the instant you breathe in. Cold that makes metal tools dangerous to touch with bare skin because they will take the skin with them when you pull your hand away. The Hindu Kush mountain range where many Afghan mountain families live sits at elevations between 3,000 and 7,000 meters above sea level. At these altitudes the atmosphere is thinner, which means two things that compound each other into a survival crisis. Fires burn less efficiently because there is less oxygen to support combustion, meaning you need more fuel to produce the same heat output. And bodies work harder to generate warmth because the thinner air delivers less oxygen per breath, reducing the metabolic efficiency that heat generation depends on. Wind at these altitudes moves faster than at lower elevations and carries more destructive thermal force. It doesn't just make you feel colder. It physically strips the thin layer of warm air that your body naturally maintains against your skin, eliminating the buffer between your body temperature and the air temperature. Wind chill at -25 degrees Celsius in a 60 km/h wind creates conditions equivalent to -45 degrees Celsius in still air. Exposed skin at those conditions develops frostbite in under 5 minutes. And winter at these altitudes doesn't arrive briefly. It arrives in October and it doesn't release its grip until May. 7 months of conditions that range from brutally cold to unsurvivably cold, depending on the day and what the wind decides to do. Into these conditions, Afghan mountain families brought no modern technology. And they survived anyway. Every single winter. With their children. With their grandparents. With their newborns. This isn't mythology or exaggeration. It's documented history that continues in some of these mountain communities today. The system they built to make this possible started long before the first cold night arrived. It started in the decisions made during the warmer months about where to sleep, how to prepare the sleeping space, what materials to gather and process, and how to arrange every element of the night's survival environment before darkness fell and temperatures dropped. The sleeping space itself was the foundation of everything. Afghan mountain families who survived brutal winters weren't sleeping in whatever space was convenient. They were sleeping in carefully selected and prepared environments whose every characteristic had been evaluated for thermal performance. And the first principle that governed this evaluation was one that surprises most modern people because it contradicts the assumption that above-ground structures are always preferable. The ground holds heat. Not the surface of the ground, which freezes solid and radiates cold upward. But the earth at depth, even just 1 meter below the surface, maintains temperatures of 8 to 12 degrees Celsius year-round regardless of what is happening above. The mountain could be experiencing minus 40 degrees Celsius blizzard conditions at the surface, while 1 meter down the earth is stable at 10 degrees Celsius. That 50-degree temperature differential between surface and subsurface is the thermal resource that Afghan mountain families learned to exploit. Sleeping spaces built into the earth, rather than on top of it, accessed this stable thermal zone on 3 sides and below simultaneously. The surrounding earth wasn't just failing to make things worse. It was actively contributing warmth, radiating its stable temperature into the living space continuously through the night. A small fire in a space surrounded by Earth at 10 degrees Celsius had to overcome a much smaller temperature differential to maintain comfortable conditions than the same fire in an above-ground structure surrounded by air at minus 35 degrees Celsius. This is why the sleeping quarters in traditional Afghan mountain homes were positioned below ground level whenever terrain and soil conditions permitted. Not because Afghan mountain people lacked the ability to build above ground, but because below-ground sleeping spaces performed better in their specific climate conditions, and performance was the only metric that mattered when the alternative to good performance was a dead family. The preparation of these sleeping spaces before winter arrived was systematic and thorough in ways that reveal exactly how seriously Afghan mountain families took the coming cold. The process began with the floor, because the floor was where sleeping bodies would spend the most vulnerable hours of every night, and a poorly prepared floor would undermine every other element of the system regardless of how well those elements were executed. Raw earth floors in sleeping spaces created multiple problems simultaneously. They conducted cold upward from the frozen ground below. They absorbed moisture from the air and from any spills, becoming damp surfaces that eliminated insulation effectiveness in anything placed on them. They created uneven surfaces that made achieving the snug body-to-bedding contact that thermal efficiency required difficult. Afghan mountain families addressed all 3 problems through a layered floor preparation that modern material scientists would recognize as applying correct principles of thermal management. The first layer was a compacted mixture of clay and straw that created a sealed surface preventing moisture from rising from the earth below. This layer was worked while wet and allowed to dry completely before additional layers were added, creating a hard, stable base that wouldn't shift or crack through the repeated freeze-thaw cycles of mountain winter. On this sealed base came woven wool carpets whose dense fiber structure created millions of tiny trapped air pockets. The wool fibers themselves were poor heat conductors, meaning warmth didn't pass through them quickly in either direction. The air pockets between fibers were even better insulators. Together, a wool carpet of adequate thickness created a thermal barrier between the cold earth below and the sleeping bodies above that dramatically reduced conductive heat loss through the floor. Over the carpets came thick felt padding made from compressed wool fibers that had been processed specifically for density and thermal performance. Afghan feltmaking was a skilled craft-producing material whose thermal resistance modern synthetic insulation manufacturers have difficulty matching despite having access to manufacturing technology that Afghan feltmakers never had. The compression of fibers in felt eliminated most of the air spaces present in woven wool, replacing them with a dense fiber matrix that conducted heat very slowly in either direction. This combination, sealed clay base, woven wool carpet, dense felt padding, created a sleeping surface whose temperature remained dramatically higher than the earth below, allowing bodies to lie on it for hours without the conductive heat loss that would otherwise drain warmth from sleeping people through the night. The walls of the sleeping space received preparation that addressed the second major pathway for heat loss from sleeping bodies, radiation. Every surface at a lower temperature than the human body receives radiant heat from that body continuously, a process that requires no contact and no airflow to occur. Cold stone walls or earth walls in a sleeping space were constantly receiving radiated warmth from sleeping bodies without returning any warmth, creating a continuous drain that the body's metabolism had to continuously compensate for. Afghan mountain families hung heavy wool textile panels against the walls of sleeping spaces. These panels served multiple thermal functions simultaneously. They created an air gap between the hanging textile and the wall surface, and trapped air in that gap provided additional insulation. The textile surface itself was at a higher temperature than the stone or earth behind it, reducing the temperature differential between the sleeping body and the surrounding surfaces and therefore reducing radiant heat loss. And the heavy fabric absorbed some of the warmth in the room's air, maintaining that warmth in the material, rather than allowing it to be conducted into the cold wall structure behind. The sleeping space entry was treated as the critical weak point it was. Any opening between the interior sleeping environment and the outside air was a potential pathway for cold infiltration that could destroy the thermal environment the preparation had created. Afghan mountain families sealed sleeping space entries with layered hanging textiles, multiple heavy wool panels that overlapped to eliminate gaps, whose combined weight ensured they fell straight and sealed the opening effectively against the wind pressure that would otherwise push cold air inward. These entry coverings were managed carefully during the periods when people moved in and out of the sleeping space in the evening, minimizing the duration of exposure each time the covering was disturbed. Once the family was settled for the night, the covering was arranged with particular care, sometimes weighted at the bottom to ensure complete sealing, creating the most effective possible barrier between the carefully prepared interior environment and the killing cold outside. The fire preparation that preceded sleep each night was as systematic as the physical preparation of the sleeping space. Afghan mountain families understood that the fire they built in the evening hours was doing more than warming the air in the immediate present. It was loading thermal mass for the night ahead, heating the stone surrounding the hearth, warming the earth walls of the sleeping space, raising the temperature of every material in the room to levels that would slowly radiate back during the sleeping hours when the fire was reduced. This thermal mass loading required time. A fire built an hour before sleep provided warmth during that hour, but hadn't had sufficient time to heat the surrounding materials to their maximum thermal storage capacity. Afghan mountain families built their evening fires with enough lead time that the stone, earth, and textile surfaces of the sleeping space were fully charged with stored warmth before sleep began. The difference this made to overnight survival was significant. A sleeping space whose walls and floor had been fully heat-loaded during the evening hours would drop temperature much more slowly through the night than a space where only the air had been warmed. The stored heat in surrounding materials released gradually and continuously, extending the effective warmth of the evening fire for hours after the fire itself was reduced to embers. The fuel management required to accomplish this thermal mass loading without exhausting the winter fuel supply required the kind of precise calibration that comes only from extensive experience. Too large a fire built too long depleted the fuel supply that had to last through months of similar nights. Too small a fire for too short a time failed to adequately load the thermal mass, meaning the sleeping space cooled too quickly through the night. The correct approach was learned through seasons of experience where the consequences of miscalibration were immediately felt in the quality of the night's warmth and the state of the fuel supply as winter progressed. The sleeping space preparation and fire management gave Afghan mountain families their foundation. But the foundation alone didn't keep anyone alive through the night. What happened to the bodies inside that carefully prepared space? The clothing layered onto them, the bedding wrapped around them, the arrangements made between family members, and the specific treatments applied when temperatures became genuinely dangerous, determined whether the foundation translated into survival or whether a family woke up cold, sick, frostbitten, or didn't wake up at all. The clothing system Afghan mountain families used for sleeping was built on a principle that contradicts modern instinct so completely that most contemporary people do exactly the wrong thing when they try to sleep in cold conditions. The instinct is to remove daytime clothing, put on lighter sleepwear, and rely on bedding to provide warmth. In a heated bedroom with a thermostat maintaining comfortable temperature, this works fine. In an Afghan mountain sleeping space where the fire has been reduced to embers and the temperature is dropping steadily through the night, this instinct will kill you. Afghan mountain families added clothing at night rather than removing it. Every layer worn during the day became the base layer of the sleeping system, already warmed by body heat, already conformed to the body's shape, already doing the work of trapping warm air against the skin. Removing these layers to sleep meant starting the night with cold fabric against skin, fabric that would spend the first hour of sleep being warmed by the body rather than contributing warmth to it, during the most critical period when temperatures were dropping fastest. Over daytime clothing came additional layers specifically reserved for sleep. The innermost additional layer was always wool against any skin that daytime clothing left exposed. Wool's unique fiber structure gives it a property that no other natural material matches in the same way. It continues insulating when wet. A person who perspires during the night doesn't wake in cold, damp fabric that has lost all thermal resistance. The wool fiber maintains its air-trapping structure even as it absorbs moisture, wicking that moisture away from skin contact while continuing to insulate. This single property made wool the non-negotiable foundation of the Afghan mountain sleep clothing system. The middle layers were thick sheepskin and goatskin garments with the fleece facing inward toward the body. The fleece side of a sheepskin is one of nature's most effective insulators because of the density of individual fibers and the crimped structure of those fibers that maximizes air trapping per unit of thickness. Afghan mountain families had access to sheep breeds whose fleece density was exceptional, and they processed those fleeces specifically to preserve the crimped fiber structure that provided maximum insulation rather than processing methods that would have made the material softer but thermally weaker. The outer layer was dense felt or tightly woven wool that served a single critical purpose: blocking wind from penetrating the insulating layers beneath. Wind is insulation's enemy because it displaces the trapped air that provides thermal resistance. A layer of fleece that traps millions of tiny air pockets provides excellent insulation in still conditions. The same fleece layer with wind moving through it loses most of its effectiveness because the trapped air is continuously replaced by moving cold air. The outer wind-blocking layer preserved the effectiveness of every insulating layer inside it, multiplying the thermal performance of the entire system. Every part of the body received specific attention during the clothing layering process, because different body parts lose heat at dramatically different rates and through different mechanisms. Understanding these differences and addressing each one specifically was knowledge that Afghan mountain families had refined through generations of winters where incomplete attention to any body part created problems that the whole system then had to compensate for. The head was addressed first because heat loss through the head during sleep is disproportionate to its size. The brain demands continuous high-volume blood supply, and that blood carries warmth from the body's core to the head's surface where it radiates into the surrounding air. A thick wool cap that covered not just the crown of the head, but the ears and the back of the neck was non-negotiable in the Afghan mountain sleep clothing system. The ears are particularly vulnerable. They protrude from the head, have high surface area relative to their mass, and have blood vessels close to the surface that make them efficient heat radiators and efficient frostbite targets. The neck was wrapped separately from the head covering, with a wool scarf or neck wrap that eliminated the gap between the head covering and the body's upper garments. That gap, if left unaddressed, created a pathway where warm air accumulated inside the clothing system could escape upward past the neck and be replaced by cold air drawn in from below. Sealing this pathway kept the warm air inside the clothing envelope rather than allowing it to convect away through the night. Hands were drawn inside the clothing system rather than being left exposed at the ends of sleeves. The hands, like the ears, have high surface area relative to mass and blood vessels close to the surface that facilitate rapid heat loss. Afghan mountain families used wool mittens that covered the hands completely, pulling them inside the sleeping bundle rather than leaving them at the bundle's cold edges where they would both lose heat rapidly and create cold spots that pulled warmth from the surrounding bedding. Feet received the most elaborate protection of any extremity because they were simultaneously the most vulnerable to cold and the most difficult to keep warm. Feet are the furthest point from the body's core, meaning blood has to travel the greatest distance to reach them, and the cardiovascular system reduces blood flow to feet first when cold stress begins, sacrificing peripheral warmth to protect core temperature. Once feet begin cooling significantly, they cool rapidly, and the cooling affects the entire body's thermal comfort. Afghan mountain families wrapped feet in multiple layers before sleep. The innermost layer was soft processed wool that wicked moisture away from skin, because foot perspiration is continuous and damp insulation fails. Over this came thick wool socks whose fiber structure was specifically preserved for maximum air trapping. Over the socks came sheepskin foot wrappings with the fleece facing inward, adding another layer of insulation. This entire foot assembly was then tucked into a designated warm pocket within the bedding system, surrounded by the main bedding on all sides rather than being allowed to extend into a corner of the sleeping bundle where they would be exposed to the coldest air in the bedding system. The bedding that went over all these clothing layers was layered with the same deliberate system as the clothing itself, but addressed different heat loss mechanisms. Clothing managed heat loss from the body's surface into the air immediately surrounding the body. Bedding managed heat loss from that air layer into the space above and around the sleeping person. Together they created a nested thermal system where each layer addressed the specific mechanism by which warmth was lost at that level. The bottom bedding layers focused entirely on interrupting conduction from the floor through to sleeping bodies. Even with the floor preparation of sealed clay, wool carpet, and felt padding, temperature differential between the floor and sleeping bodies still drove a slow upward flow of cold through the bedding layers. These heated stones were wrapped in wool to prevent burns from direct contact before being positioned within the sleeping bundle near the bodies of the most vulnerable sleepers. Against the lower back near the kidneys, whose warming supports overall metabolic function. Near the feet, where supplemental heat to the most thermally challenged extremity reduced the full body cold stress that began when feet cooled significantly. Against the abdomen, where warmth supported the digestive processes that generated metabolic heat from the evening's food. The monitoring of these heated stones through the night required someone to maintain partial wakefulness, checking periodically that the stones retained adequate warmth and repositioning them as family members shifted during sleep. This monitoring role rotated among capable adults, ensuring that the responsibility was shared rather than destroying a single person's sleep completely. An adult who had taken the monitoring role the previous night slept more deeply the following night, while another adult took responsibility. The rotation maintained the monitoring system without creating the dangerous cumulative sleep deprivation that a single monitor would experience. On the nights when temperatures dropped to their absolute extremes, when everything the clothing and bedding and sleeping arrangement system could provide still left the most vulnerable family members at risk, Afghan mountain families employed skin treatments that addressed heat loss at the most fundamental level. Animal fat rendered from available species into thick, slow-melting substances was rubbed directly onto the exposed skin surfaces that no clothing layer covered, primarily the face, where breathing required leaving the nose and mouth uncovered regardless of conditions. Buffalo and sheep tallow was the most commonly available fat in Afghan mountain communities, and it had thermal properties well suited to the application. At body temperature it softened and spread easily. At the cold temperatures of the sleeping space it maintained thickness and didn't run, staying in place on skin surfaces through the night rather than absorbing or evaporating away. The fat layer created a physical barrier between skin and air that blocked wind from reaching the skin surface, eliminated the wind chill effect at the body surface, and reduced the rate of radiant heat loss from skin to the cold air of the sleeping space. The application targeted the specific facial areas most vulnerable to frostbite: cheeks, the tip of the nose, the area around the eyes, the forehead. These areas were coated thoroughly before the family settled for the night, creating a protective layer that would maintain its effectiveness through the sleeping hours. For children, this application was done by adults who ensured complete coverage of the vulnerable areas without gaps that would leave any skin unprotected. Mixed with wood ash, the fat became a paste with properties beyond simple barrier protection. The carbon particles in ash absorb radiant heat from nearby fire and hold it at the skin surface, creating a layer that actively retained warmth rather than simply passively blocking cold. This paste was applied on the most extreme nights when passive protection wasn't considered sufficient, particularly to the pulse points on the wrists and sides of the neck where blood vessels ran close to the surface and heat loss was disproportionate. The complete system that Afghan mountain families executed every night, the space preparation, the fire management, the clothing layering, the bedding construction, the sleeping arrangement, the stone heating, the skin treatment, worked because every element addressed a specific mechanism through which cold kills sleeping people. Remove any element, and the system degraded in specific, predictable ways that experienced Afghan mountain people could immediately identify and correct. A night where the stones weren't adequately heated before sleep showed in the morning, the most vulnerable sleepers woke colder than they should have, and the experienced adults in the family understood exactly which element had failed and what to do differently the following evening. A night where the entry covering wasn't adequately sealed showed in the temperature of the sleeping space by midnight, and the fire tender who noticed the infiltration could correct the covering without waking the family. This immediate feedback from consequences was the teaching system that kept the knowledge accurate across generations. Children who grew up in Afghan mountain families didn't learn survival techniques abstractly. They experienced every element of the system from infancy, felt the difference between adequate and inadequate preparation, watched adults make and correct mistakes, and gradually took on responsibility for elements of the system as their experience made them capable. By the time a young Afghan mountain person was managing the sleeping system for their own family, they had spent years developing the sensory knowledge that made competent management possible. They knew by feel whether the floor preparation was adequate. They knew by the air quality in the sleeping space whether ventilation was balanced correctly. They knew by the behavior of the fire whether fuel quality and quantity would sustain the necessary heat through the night. They knew by the feel of heated stones whether those stones had absorbed sufficient thermal energy to serve their purpose. This embodied knowledge, developed through direct experience across years of mountain winters, was more reliable than any written instruction could be because it included the judgment that direct experience develops and abstraction cannot transmit. Afghan families who possessed this knowledge slept safely through conditions that would kill people equipped with modern gear but lacking the knowledge to use it correctly in these specific conditions. The mountain didn't become less dangerous for Afghan families who mastered this system. It remained exactly as cold, exactly as brutal, exactly as capable of killing anyone who made significant errors. What changed was the family's ability to meet the mountain's challenge with a complete and accurate response, covering every pathway through which cold could reach sleeping bodies and maintaining that coverage through the entire night regardless of what conditions outside were doing. That's what allowed Afghan families to sleep in freezing mountains with no modern technology. Not toughness or adaptation that made cold less dangerous to their bodies. Not mystical connection to the mountain environment that outsiders couldn't access. But knowledge.